from London, this is the Standard Podcast, and I'm Mark Blunden.
The dictator is gone. The freedom for Syria, we pay a huge price for that.
Syrians awoke on Monday to a hopeful, if uncertain, future after the rebel group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham seized the capital Damascus. And the country's dictator President Bashar al-Assad reportedly fled to Russia following 13 years of civil war and more than half a century of his family's brutal rule, as rescuers search for tens of thousands of prisoners held in the regime's underground torture prisons in horrific conditions. What's now for Syria, and how will the weekend's events impact the wider Middle East crisis?
I welcome the fact that Assad has gone. The Syrian people had to put up with his brutal regime for far too long. We're talking to regional allies. It's very important now that there's a political settlement, a political way forward. And it's very important that we emphasise that civilians and minorities must be protected in this process. But very pleased that Assad has fallen. That's
Sir Keir Starmer speaking to the PA news agency during a visit to the Gulf states. And the PM was asked whether the UK's designation of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham as a terrorist group would change.
Well, it's very early days at the moment. We do need a political solution to this, and that's what we're talking to regional allies about. It is a good thing that Assad is gone, a very good thing for the Syrian people. What we must also ensure as we go through this, the rejection of terrorism and violence, and that civilians are protected, minorities are protected, and that can only be through a political process. That's what we're talking to allies in the region about at the moment.
Now, we're joined by the London Standard's defence editor, Robert Fox. What were the fast-moving events over the weekend that led to the fall and the fleeing of Assad in just 24 hours?
Well, there's one crucial factor, and it's the withdrawal of Hezbollah, the Shia militia, which had become a proper army through all the fighting in Syria and Iraq, much to the reluctance of a lot of the commanders who are Lebanese Shia, that they said they couldn't go on. They didn't want to go on being the backbone to Assad's army. And it wasn't generally realized how much that army depended on the skill, the training, the presence of, one, Hezbollah, two, the Russian support. And the Russians also have been distracted by events, obviously, in Ukraine. They were watching the insurgents in Idlib. By that, I mean British intelligence, American intelligence, undoubtedly the French, the Israelis, and the Turks. And probably the Israelis and the Turks and the Saudis knew what was going on and may well have had a hand in all this. But the speed completely took everybody by surprise.
What do we know about Hayat Tahrir al-Sham's goals? And you mentioned in terms of their alliances, what are their supply lines and ideology? What's their plan now?
Well, their supply lines, how they've managed to do it is pretty incredible, because they've been bombed when they were in Aleppo, which they have retaken. They were bombed in Idlib. But Mohammed al-Jilani, the leader, seems to have been very astute, because he was associated with the affiliates of al-Qaeda, they were known as the al-Nusra Front, and it broke very clearly his element with IS, the Islamic State, who was led by Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who was, I think, killed. It's not quite clear the circumstances in which he was killed, but he raised the flag of the Islamic State in Mosul in 2014. And it's interesting that in that movement before, Jilani had been there. He had been there with a psychopath called Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who really created al-Qaeda in Iraq. I hope I'm making it sound quite complex, because what we're talking here is mosaics and kaleidoscopes and the way things shift. Now, what has happened as he's getting close to power, Jilani has become more moderate. So, yes, I'm going to protect minorities. Golly, he wouldn't have said that 10 years ago, particularly the Christians, about 500,000 Christians. I want people to come back, and I want us to build a government. Now, can he be trusted at face value? It's very difficult, because having been denounced uphill and down dale, we get people like Pat McFadden, the key minister, the enforcer in Keir Starmer's government, saying we should perhaps take Hayat Tahrir al-Sham's, HTS, as we call it, off the prescribed list. And it looks as if that's what Trump is moving to in America. They're trying to bring them into the dialogue. By the way, if I can add, they've learned from the horrible mistakes they made in Iraq. I mean, by that I mean America and the Brits and in Libya. You embrace, you don't exclude.
Let's go to a quick break. Coming up in part 2, how will the toppling of the Assad regime and the emergence of HTS impact the Middle East crisis? If you're new here, please do make sure to press follow and give us a rating. Welcome back. Now back to the London Standard's defence editor, Robert Fox. Robert, we've seen some truly shocking details and footage that we're just discovering the extent of the brutality of Assad's regime since he fled as well.
Well, what's so interesting is that really high-priced diplomats, people who have been doing not the game, it's actually a profession, and they do it for choice and do it with great privation in some cases. But there are two I particularly know who absolutely abhorred the disgusting performance, the psychopathic performance of particularly the Assad regime, and it was inherited. It was a clan. They're a minority. They're from a minority grouping, again, the mosaic, called the Alawites, who are almost dissident Shias from the northwest of Syria. And they, under Hafez al-Assad, who was an Air Force general, they built this shield around them of this incredibly unlawful behavior. On the rise to power, they were 10 years in office, and Hafez al-Assad, this is Bashar's father, his brother, Rifat, carried out a terrible massacre against Muslim Sunni devout militants. They were part of the Brotherhood in Hama in 1982. And it goes on through the family because the big performer this time round was Bashar al-Assad's cousin, not his brother, Maher, who commanded the 4th Division, which seems to have been doing dreadful things, including it surrounded Homs when my friend, the very distinguished journalist Marie Colvin, was killed, for example, but known almost for psychopathic behavior. One other detail which is fascinating about Maher, of course, he made his money through drugs, and the 4th Division was the big conduit of drugs, by all accounts, to the Syrian army. And it eviscerated, it weakened, it emasculated the Syrian army. Interesting or not, it's fascinating to see because, of course, the region is awash with drugs. Very high quality hash, the Lebanese blonde, these things from the Bekaa Valley and so on, but also the flow of opium and morphine base from Afghanistan.
And for Assad himself, now in exile in Russia.
Well, yeah, I mean, because of the performance and what we're seeing, the dreadful conditions in which these poor prisoners, and they were held hostages, women, children. I mean, honestly, with his British-born wife, I have very little sympathy for them at all. And there are one or two colleagues of mine, and in the past, certain British prime ministers, of course, tried to work their way through that. We can have no time for this at all. I mean, whether he himself is one or not, the entourage, which is so important, particularly with Bashar, because most of the time they didn't think he was up to it. So these real toughs that he inherited from Hafez, his father, sort of en garde. A lot of them were Palestinians. 2 or 3 key players were absolute psychopaths in the way that they behaved. They didn't believe in the norms and behaviors of ethical conduct in running society. This was gangster rule to the nth degree.
Finally, you mentioned earlier in terms of Israel and Hezbollah, but in your experience, with your knowledge, where does this now leave events strategically as those tectonic plates have shifted once more? Where does this leave the conflict for specifically Israel, Hezbollah and Hamas?
Well, we're not quite sure where it takes Hamas, but read my column. The 2 regional powers that are exploiting this, not exactly for general peace and harmony across this whole world are one Turkey, two Israel. And they've been very active today as we speak. Israel will try and reinforce its borders with Lebanon, where the ceasefire seems to be holding, with a lot of activity and firing in it, which always happens in these ceasefires. They've been attacking possible bases in Syria, as they always did, worried about the arms dumps and the places awash with arms, with possibly the remains of quite big chemical weapons arsenals. That's Israel. And going up to the Golan Heights, which they were neutralized in 1973, reinforcing the borders, Israel. Turkey really pressing away, has claims into northern Syria. Erdogan, Recep Tayyip, has big claims to be a big regional player, and he wants to bash the Kurds. Now, if he bashes the Kurds too hard, the YPG militias, which have been in this insurgency, they hold as prisoners some of the nastiest elements of the Islamic State. And if they're let out, we could have another flow, not only of refugees, but of terrorists.
And that's The Standard. For the latest news, head over to standard.co.uk. This podcast is back tomorrow at 4 p.m.